Okay, first of all, I want to say hello to everyone and thank you for participating in this Zoom meeting. I want to introduce Karl, our new friend from the page. Well, Karl is an architect and a curator. He studied in the American University in Dubai to attain his bachelor degree in architecture. He later pursued a master's in architecture and historic urban environments at UCL and another master's in heritage studies from the University of Cambridge. Karl's background in the world of cultural heritage led him to participate in the development of multiple museums and exhibit projects across the UAE. In the case of Lebanon, he is passionate about the classical past. He is also the co-founder of Classical Lebanon, a page on Instagram dedicated to our country's legacy in classical architecture. It is not just a page in raising awareness, but a page also to show that there is still a place for it as a design language in Lebanon. Well, first of all, Karl, we'd like to thank you from the Wandering Maronite team. To all the participants, I would like to ask you when the Zoom meeting time is over to re-enter from the same link. And if anyone has a question, that will be left to the end of the conference. Also, if anyone has a question in Arabic, we'll gladly translate it to Karl. And we hope you pass a great conference and a great evening with us.
Sorry about that. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Just wondering, can you hear me?
Yes, sound is perfect, Karl.
All right, perfect. Shall we wait maybe a minute longer to see if anyone else will join, or shall we just continue?
Yeah, I think we can wait one more minute.
Yeah, let's wait another minute, just in case. If not, I'll be happy to proceed.
Karl, I think it's better that we start now and people join us later on.
All right, let's do that then. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. And the purpose of this presentation, well, it serves as an introductory course, so to speak, about classical architecture and its principles and how it played a role in Lebanon. Now, there's a lot to talk about, and studying classical architecture can take an entire lifetime. So I've tried my best to condense it in a very informal style and basically to introduce the philosophy and rationale behind this unique design language. Essentially, this presentation aims to give you the tools so that you can better see what classical architecture is all about and understand, obviously, its legacy in Lebanon. So I'd like to invite everyone to take a look at this photo, a view of Beirut from 1890. There's no denying that it's overwhelmingly beautiful, but you can also feel a sense of nostalgia. But it's strange that you would feel nostalgia for a time you haven't lived. So what is this all about? And then when you compare it to a view of Beirut today, it does quite the opposite effect. There's chaos, and you almost feel sorry for the buildings on the bottom right. But we can blame the civil war, we can blame the system. But in reality, when we compare to examples in history, like Renaissance Italy, the peninsula, Italy, was never unified. There was constant wars, and yet they were still able to produce the greatest works of art and architecture the world has ever seen. Here's a comparison between two St. George churches. I'd like to invite you again to take a deeper look into these photos. Which one do you feel respects the context, has a timeless feel in design, and is an inviting space? And what about our institutions? Both of them are police stations. Unfortunately, the one on the left is demolished, but it gives off a sense of stability, security, and order. Why is that? Perhaps it has something to do with the Tuscan columns on the ground floor that ensures a sense of stability. And the one on the right does quite an opposite effect. The facade has a labyrinth feel to it. And as we know in ancient Greek mythologies, labyrinths were designed to confuse people. The purpose of this presentation isn't to insult modern architecture. On the contrary, there's still a place for it. There is still a place for iconic designs. But when there's too many of them, it creates visual intrusion and chaos. And we should also be careful about labeling things as classical architecture, because many examples today that proclaim to be as such are actually illiterate forms of classical architecture. And this is something that's happening worldwide, whether it is in the USA or in Lebanon. Something about these designs feels inherently wrong. So that's how classical Lebanon came to be. Our purpose isn't just to spread awareness of Lebanon's great classical heritage. It's also to show that there is still a place in this time and in our country to design it in the classical language of architecture, that there is still hope to create these principles and to make Lebanon as beautiful as it was once before. So what exactly is classical architecture? So it has its roots in the worlds of Greece, in the temple architecture of the Greek world, and in the religious, military, and civil architecture of the Romans. As all of us architecture students know, Vitruvius was the first person to codify architecture as a work of literature. He talked about the orders. And these orders, of course, have their standard varieties and standard run of moldings, like the Tuscan, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. And well, the composite was a later Renaissance addition. But what is the essence of classical architecture? Is it just the ornamentations? Or is it the proportional system behind it? As we saw in the illiterate examples, they've taken the ornaments out of context. And at the same time, modern architects like Corbusier used the proportioning system of classical architecture, but the end result isn't a classical work of architecture. The best way to explain classical architecture is through the 10 Timeless Canons by Francois Gabriel. A special thanks goes out to architect Eric Evans from the ICAA, who introduced this in his course, the Classical Primer. So shout out to him. Thank you very much. And I think going through each of these 10 examples will give us a better idea on what classical architecture is all about. So let's start off with bilateral symmetry. So symmetry is something that occurs in the natural world. It implies a sense of stability, health, and equilibrium. Essentially, it is a reflection of us. So whether you see examples from the early Renaissance period or the classical world or Baroque period, a strong sense of symmetry is always implied. Anthropomorphism, the human body as the model for projection into our buildings. Just like our bodies, there is a proportional relationship between the parts, and that is also translated into classical architecture. And in many ways, there tends to be the golden proportion, the golden mean embedded within many of these great works from antiquity and the Renaissance. And those golden mean proportions are also found within nature. So a quick crash course on how to achieve the golden rectangle is you draw a square, divide it in half, draw a diagonal line, take your compass, swing it down, and then that's the extent of the golden rectangle. And surprisingly, you'll find this shape in almost every aspect of classical architecture and in the natural world. And this wasn't a secret solely made by the ancient world in terms of like the classical Greek and Roman world. It was found in ancient Egypt up until the medieval period as well. But in the Renaissance, there was this craze and hunger for all things antiquity from the classical world. Elites would commission many people to go out and search for ancient manuscripts and classical sculptures that could help them with their projects. And in a sense, there was an archaeological investigation unlike any other, not in a scientific manner, but on an artistic level. So a great way to explain that part of the early Renaissance period about the appreciation for the human body, we could see examples of Donatello's statues of David. On the left, we see it as a typical medieval design. It's quite static, it's quite stiff and elongated. But over the course of the years and constant study of the past, of antiquity, Donatello perfected anatomy in his next David statue from 1440. And this also applies to architects from that time, especially by Leon Battista Alberti. And his work is an excellent way to understand how things progressed in such a short period of time. So when we look at these two things, they're technically classical works of architecture. But you might think to yourself, like, you've got to be kidding me. How is this classical? It looks like a mixture of Gothic and there's tons of motifs going on. Well, we can see the triumphal arch in this part, and then the temple motif on the top part. But it feels like you could almost snap it in half. It's not quite well composed, so to speak. And then you look at his later works, which still takes the triumphal arch and the temple motif, but he combines it harmoniously to create a very solid-like effect. And you might be thinking that there's a lot of complex geometries going behind these designs, but in reality, clear and simple geometry is key. The circle and square is the main alphabet in the composition of classical architecture. And they are organized by regulating lines to achieve harmony. So they're not just placed at random. There's a clear logical process behind each composition. So I'll take you through an example of Villa Rotonda, which is the first example of residential architecture, a secular building that takes on the temple religious motif. So when we look at his composition, of course, Andrea Palladio was quite a genius in the way he organized his spaces using rhythmic proportions. But in reality, if we just take the simple square and divide into 4 equal parts and do a cross diagonal for each part, we start to understand that there's a connection going on in here. And that ends up, so the main space, which is that square, is also used to create the proportions for the monumental staircases that you see in the first photo. Nothing is ever just done by accident or through a whimsical design. Even great works of classical architecture, like the Pantheon in ancient Rome, I mean, it looks like a perfect circle on a section, but in reality, as just like how I showed you before, it is composed using the golden section. A lot of people assume that the golden section is something that is limiting, but in reality, the options for creativity is endless. And even Santa Maria Novella, which I've discussed earlier as an early example of classical architecture, although flimsy looking, a lot of thought went into the composition with circles and squares. And Baroque architecture. So Baroque, people have a misconception of Baroque architecture. They assume that if you just slap on some ornamentations, you'll get Baroque architecture. But in reality, they actually took geometry to the next level, but at the same time, it's still quite simple. As you could see on the far right picture, it's 2 circles overlapping to create a vesica piscis, as you can see here, with regulating lines that aren't just done out of thin air. There's a logical process behind it, and it creates these mini spaces, these chapels. And defined spaces. So in classical architecture, rooms shouldn't be ambiguous. They should have clear corners. And from each transitional space, there needs to be an implication that there's thick load-bearing construction. And within outdoor spaces, it's the idea of creating outdoor rooms is still at heart here. Everything is based on a grid. And this is a wonderful example of the grid system in play from The Ideal City by Fra Carnevale. juxtaposition of discrete forms. A confusing sentence. So basically, juxtaposition is the act of placing two or more items to create something interesting, and discrete means individually distinct. So it's the idea of using two or more items to that are distinct to create an overall composition. So when you look at an example by Andrea Palladio, A Church in Venice, each space is whole on its own. There's a clear system going on behind it. But in reality, even though it's well composed and it seems like a complete organism, each space can be separated and understood on its own. An emphasis on center, corners, and sides. So walls, floors, and ceilings respond to others and share a common axis. And a great way to look at the genius of classical architects is to see how they treated the corners. This is a wonderful study by Luca Guarini, who I see in the presentation right now. Hello. He made a great layout to show how classical architects throughout history have come up with ingenious ways to create facade transitions. Some can imply a light design and others a very fortified feel. A truly fascinating study that could easily debunk that classical architecture is a copy-paste job. A limited inventory of parts. So in classical architecture, you can identify it with its use of specific parts, and these parts are identified as types. And as you can see with the moldings on the Corinthian order, these are the building blocks of the actual order. So each order has their own set of parts that you need to abide by. And these orders that I've mentioned are the Tuscan, the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian, and the Composite. But at the same time, people have altered them and just come up with their own systems, but at risk. So for example, every architect throughout history who is a self-proclaimed classical practitioner had his own set of what is a beautiful order. This is done through measured drawings. So for example, in the case of Palladio, he came up with his own system of proportions after studying the ruins of Rome and studying them meticulously. And even centuries later, people questioned his work, and sometimes they found incorrect measurements. So classical architecture is always an ongoing dialogue. And at the same time, you don't have to abide by the 5 orders. And purists might get angry at this statement, but you could see these examples of people breaking the rules, like Michelangelo's order at the Laurentian Library. This isn't any particular order. This isn't Doric. This isn't anything. But because he understood the proportions behind that system, he was able to get away with it. Especially Guarini, who created this interesting wobbling effect to imply that it's carrying something unbelievably heavy. And you can see it with that mini entablature on the top middle part here. And he's come up with his own Corinthian designs. Inherent formal hierarchies. Classical architecture loves hierarchies, so the order of importance. So when you enter a classical work of architecture, a building, the rooms in the center are always larger. And in terms of order of importance, while using the orders like the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, you can't just place them in any order. Baroque architects did that, but they did that while being informed. But the easy way to go about this is to keep in mind that the Doric starts in the bottom, then the Ionic, and then the Corinthian, because each order has their own set of characteristics. Because, for example, throughout history, the Doric order was seen as the masculine order, the Doric and the Tuscan in particular. And that's why this type of design that you see here, which is an elevation of the Colosseum, the Tuscan and the Doric was reserved for buildings that are military purposes and agrarian buildings. Regularity. Classical architecture loves rhythmic repetitions, and that grid allows for that to happen. And it strengthens the impression of the building. So you can tell by the motifs, the repetition of certain elements that, okay, what I'm looking at on the bottom floor is something for public use. It's heavy, it's rusticated. I can enter that archway, it's inviting. On the top part, it tells quite a different story. So classical architecture does love its regular repetitions. And now the last thing, the tripartite organization, the rule of three. So in classical architecture, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that takes many forms. So for example, when we look at this generic drawing of a Tuscan archway by Vignola, we can see the rule of three at play here. There's the pedestal, the column, and the entablature. The capital, the shaft, and the base. And for the entablature, the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. So now that we're done with a quick and fast crash course on classical architecture, it's time to discuss the classical legacy of Lebanon. So here's a quick timeline. We always begin with the Phoenicians. So a lot of people assume that classicism was introduced to the Eastern Mediterranean from Alexander the Great's conquest. But in reality, the Phoenicians beat him to it. So although they've adopted, let's say, Persian motifs in their architecture, the Phoenicians were essentially masters in absorbing the best aesthetic qualities of the ancient world. So what they've done here is they would take the Egyptian base of a sarcophagus and then slap a classical face on the sarcophagus. And they did that with their terracotta votive figures too. There is a wonderful collection of anthropoid sarcophagi in the National Museum of Beirut, and some are a lot more realistic in that facial composition than the others. So the Phoenicians technically accepted classicism way before the ancient Greeks showed up at its shores. And of course, Roman Phoenicia. After the fall of the Greek or Seleucid Empire in the region, the Romans came. And the Romans, as we all know, created wonderful works of architecture in Lebanon. I believe there are more than 30 Roman temples and sites in Lebanon, and most of them are in excellent, excellent condition. But the most famous ones that people generally know are the Roman ruins at Baalbek, the Temple of Jupiter, the largest one, the Temple of Bacchus, the most preserved one, and the Temple of Venus on the bottom left, which is considered to be an early form of proto-Baroque architecture. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate going on about this. Do we call it Roman Phoenicia or do we call it Phoenician Rome? Many of these temples are not Vitruvian per se. Some exhibit Vitruvian, classical proportional details that you could see elsewhere, but a lot of them retain Eastern influences or incorporate Phoenician architecture into a Roman complex. At the same time, a scholar by the name of Kevin Butcher says we shouldn't really categorize them as distinct identities because the acceptance of one identity doesn't mean you're sacrificing the other. So instead, we should have this Renaissance-like lens on Lebanese Roman temples through this patronage view, because each temple is unique on its own. Some are more classical and Eastern than others, while others are more Eastern and classical than their neighbors, for example. So you'll find Greek inscriptions in one Roman temple, one Roman altar, and then you'll find a Latin inscription on a pediment in another. Some argue that this isn't a high priest, but the patron of that temple. So I think that's quite an interesting way to look at Roman temples in Lebanon. And it's quite difficult to categorize them given their geographical context. But we all like categories in architecture. They're easy to remember. The three most common classical architectural Roman temple types are the anti or antis, which are the extension of the pilasters with the two columns, the prostyle with its four columns on the front, the peripteral, which surrounds the temple, and so the first three are the common ones, and we have one unique one, which is the circular horseshoe-shaped one, which is the Temple of Venus that I showed earlier. An excellent example is the Ionic Temple at Ain Harsha, the anti-type. The prostyle, which is the Ionic Temple of Ziza, one of the most beautiful temples in Lebanon, according to several scholars. The peripteral type, this is the largest and most preserved Roman temple in the world so far. You have the Temple of Jupiter, but only a few columns remain. And of course, the circular proto-Baroque horseshoe type, the Corinthian Temple of Venus. And now here's a very dramatic picture of the fall of Rome. So as we know, Rome fell sometime around the 5th century because of instability and Germanic barbarian invasions. And a lot of people categorize this unstable period as a contribution to also to the downfall of art and realism. An excellent example to showcase this downfall is, well, when we look at examples at the National Museum of Beirut of high classical art from the 1st and 2nd century art, there's a great deal of attention that's paid to anatomy, with the bust of Bacchus, our own torso of Belvedere, and the Hygeia statue. And then as we proceed to the later centuries, something happens, and they don't look quite classical. Other scholars attribute that this is actually a Palmyran style of design, and others just say this is a complete degradation of classical values. And here's just a side-by-side comparison of that fluidity and pose and elegance that we see with Hygeia and the stiffness of a 5th century statue. Even portraiture on coins had that effect, suffered that, I would say, from the downfall of classicism. When we look at Hadrian on the left, this is from around 100 AD. And then fast forward 400 to 500 years later, this is what we have, and this is what set the precedent for Eastern Roman coinage, the Byzantine Empire. And they didn't even call themselves Byzantine, they still call themselves Romans, but they've detached themselves from that classical ideal of what art should be, according to the Greco-Roman world. And of course, the last example of classical architecture, I would say, in Lebanon is the Umayyad city of Anjar. This was commissioned by Islamic caliphs that came to Lebanon sometime around the 7th and 8th century. And even though this was commissioned by Islamic caliphs, the design and the layout of the city is very much Roman, especially through the grid plan and the creation of these outdoor rooms. It's very much a late Roman style, and you could see the same type of wall-like architecture, this interchange of brick and stone at the walls of Constantinople. So when did classicism return to Lebanon? So we automatically assume that classicism returned to Lebanon in the late 1800s and 1900s. And one of these prominent examples is the St. George Maronite Cathedral in Lebanon, an excellent use of the Ionic and the Corinthian order, as well as the police station, which has been unfortunately demolished during Solidaire's reconstruction in the 1990s. The Petit Serai, with its very strong Tuscan portico, also demolished, but prior to the Civil War for the purpose of urban expansion. And of course, there are some classical details that can be found in the typical Lebanese homes, the triple arch, the central homes, but they're not exactly classical in terms of proportion systems. They imply classical details, but they're not wholeheartedly classical. So that's what we think is classical. But when did it exactly come back to Lebanon? So some people argue that it came back to Lebanon during the time of Fakhreddin. Fakhreddin is an interesting character and is often credited as the first man of Lebanon. He was one of the most interesting figures in the Renaissance history from Lebanon. He went around visiting various European courts, asking for support against the Ottomans. And one of his stays was at Florence, and he was a guest of the Medici. So he stayed at places like the Palazzo Vecchio and Palazzo Medici Riccardi. And Professor Eli Haddad talks about, there's a great paper called The Tuscan Myth of Lebanon. And he tries to discredit, and rightly so, the effect of the classical legacy on Lebanon, because essentially Fakhreddin didn't really take on so much of the art from Florence, as you can see with his main hometown in Deir el-Amr, his main base. We see more of a reference to Palazzo Vecchio on the left than we do with the other palazzo. And for that, and one of the reasons, according to historians, was he preferred small windows because he found it a lot more appropriate for his his daughters and his wife. There is one scholar, French scholar, that mentions that Fakhreddin had a Italianate Renaissance classical palace in Beirut, but that has been unfortunately, well, it's been demolished or destroyed by the Ottomans or an earthquake. I can't recall, but it no longer exists. But when we see classicism in its strongest form, we see it in its church architecture, and that is due to the strong ties between the Vatican and the Maronite Church, also thanks to Fakhreddin's attempts to create that connection. But again, we don't see a strong use of the classical orders. We just see it implied slightly in its design. So when you look at examples like St. Anthony the Great at Tannurin or the church at Bikfaya, there's no use of orders. We can't tell what columns they've used, but we can imagine what they're trying to tell us with this design. It's a Roman temple, essentially. And the interior doesn't say much. Unfortunately, most of the stucco has been stripped over the years, so we can't tell if a classical order was implied through plasterwork or anything. An interesting example of what could be a classical building, which requires further study, and it was mentioned by Professor Eli Haddad, is Saint Rita in Ghadir. Originally, this was a mausoleum for Armenian Catholic bishops, and you can tell there is a bit of a node to classicism with this. If you look at the pediment, you can tell that they've taken this very Baroque-like or Renaissance-like motif of an unrolled Ionic volute. And the entasis, which is the swelling of a shape, is greatly exaggerated, but you could feel that the architect had an idea of what classical architecture should be. And in my wild speculation, perhaps the classical architect was aware of Santa Maria Novella with that unwinding volute, and at the same time was probably aware of the Phoenician altar at Fara because of its truncated shape. It's a wild assumption on my part, but I think that could be the case. Like I said, the architecture that we have in Lebanon is severely understudied, so measured drawings are a must to create a proper analysis. Another example of a classical work of architecture is Saint Joseph at Ghazir. So when we look at it, we could say to ourselves, okay, it looks quite literate. There is the tripartite organization thing going on here with, the rule of three. And at the same time, Father Ralph, the time is almost up. So I'm assuming we should end this and then rejoin the link.
Yes, I think so. It's better if we leave now and we rejoin the same link.
Okay, let's do that, because the presentation is, I think I need another 10 minutes, and
perfect.
I think we could do with another. All right. So let's all rejoin the same link. Thank you.
Yes, let's rejoin the same link. Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, I'll continue then. Right, so I was talking about Saint Joseph at the Ghazir. So we can see that the architect is aware of what's going on, right? So there is a clear understanding of classical architecture at play. The architect of Saint Joseph at Ghazir used the giant order, and the giant order is something that was popularized by Michelangelo at the Capitoline Museum. And the giant order essentially is a column or a pilaster that takes up more than one floor. So we see that here, we see that replicated here as a motif in his design. But at the same time, something weird happens. 2/3 of the entablature, which is that element that is being carried by the capital, is gone. So if we look at an example from the Temple of Nih at Niha, another great example of Roman architecture in Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley, we see the entablature here. An architrave, a frieze, and a cornice. And if we take a look at St. Joseph, we just see a very condensed architrave without the frieze and without the cornice. And something also happens that's quite strange. The dentils are in line with the capital, which is not supposed to happen according to the classical rules. So I'm not quite sure if the architect was fully, literate in his approach, or he was also playing that Michelangelo approach of breaking the rules. Again, these churches and temples need to be measured properly so that we can actually have a decisive conclusion. And again, in the interior, there's no implication of a classical order, perhaps with the pilasters. And as you can tell with an old photograph, there was stucco and there was plasterwork in the interior. Unfortunately, all of this is gone. So what is the future of classicism in Lebanon? What can we do about it today? Unfortunately, if there are any architectural practitioners or students, classical architecture is not taught. It's frowned upon. And for reasons that are too long to go into in this presentation. But at the same time, it's up to us to understand what worked in the past and how to apply it today. If it was a great solution for the ancient Greeks, for the Renaissance, for people in the 1920s, and each form and style of classical architecture was appropriate to the society and the technology of the time, why isn't it allowed or appropriate today? Why are places like the Martyrs Square on the left, why is it beautiful to us, while something on the right seems desolate? These are the same places in a span of 100 years, and it did not abide by a faithful reconstruction. So, for example, here's just a quick project of what Ilyas and Ilyas Arais is also the co-founder of Classical Lebanon and a great friend. And we had a bit of a fun experiment on St. Barbara's Day. So we wanted to do a quick design charrette, a quick studio design assignment to honor St. Barbara on her day with an architect, like a classical work of architecture, like a chapel, just to honor her, just a fun exercise. So we were inspired by her story because her story mixes in architecture, the Phoenician festivals, and of course, Roman history. St. Barbara, her hometown was actually Baalbek, Lebanon. And her father was quite overprotective, and he locked her up in the tower, hoping that the teachings of Christianity wouldn't get to her. That's why the tower, the motif of a tower, is often depicted with her in Byzantine, Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic iconographies. And this particular iconography is from Lebanon, I believe, about 150 years ago. So we were very inspired by the tower motif here. And this is actually one of the few icons that is classical in nature. At the same time, with the Temple of Venus, which is celebrated as this proto-Baroque architecture, so it was made to honor Venus, but in the early Christian years, that temple was repurposed to honor Saint Barbara instead. So we took these two elements, and at the same time, Ilyas and I were quite fascinated by the proportion system of James Gibbs. So just like Palladio and just like Vitruvius, James Gibbs had his own system, his own preference on how to approach the orders. And what we liked about James Gibbs is that it's a lot more straightforward, I would say, than the rest, but that's just a personal preference. So by studying these proportions, understanding the history of Saint Barbara in the context of Lebanon, we came up with this rough render of what a classical tower would be if it was built to honor her. So we took the tower motif, we took the horseshoe-shaped arch, we created this rusticated feel on the ground floor to give that sense of height, and at the same time, it is flushed with the entasis, and the entasis is something that sort of swells and tapers and becomes slightly thinner at the top. A classical detail that should be abided by, and that's how you could tell as well if a classical work of architecture is literate or not. So although it is rough around the edges, that's our attempt. And with this attempt, we were trying to show people on Instagram, on our page, that there is still a place for classical architecture and that you could do it too. So essentially, there's a lot of things going on now with Lebanon, and beauty and meaning is needed now more than ever, rather than infighting. And instead of more accounts that fuel divisive rhetoric and more accounts that reminisce of what Beirut used to be, it's make things beautiful in our own accord and to learn what used to work and what did not work. So I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation, and if anyone has questions, I'll answer them. Thank you.
Karl, thank you a lot for this very interesting presentation. I'm gonna unmute the participants now. For who wants to ask any questions, he can unmute himself.
I'll put my video so I can see you guys here.
Now you can all
Yes.
unmute yourselves.
I have a question.
Yes, of course. Please.
Thank you, Karl. First of all, you've talked about beauty, and throughout the presentation, one question kept popping in my mind. Sharbil, can you please mute everyone?
Yes, I will. Sorry.
Yes, that's possible. Yeah.
Yeah, when should
There we go. Okay. And is Joe unmuted too?
Yes, I'm unmuting him.
Okay, that's good now.
Go ahead, Joe. Sorry about that.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay. Never mind. Objectively speaking, what makes the classical architecture so charming and can stand the test of time versus modern architecture and contemporary architecture that seems so bland, and you have to rework it and update it every like 4 or 5 years to stay relevant? A classical architecture seems to stand the test of time throughout centuries, and it keeps me and many other persons so like it turns head, and it's like very charming, and yeah. So what is, objectively speaking, the beauty of this classical architecture? And sorry if you've answered this, but I came a little bit late to the presentation.
No, of course. We did mention it earlier, but I'm just happy to go into detail about this. So in my opinion, from what I've studied, there's two main reasons. And I'll talk about the concept behind and the material as well. So the concept behind why we find classical architecture so beautiful is because there's a proportion system that is based on nature and the human body. So in reality, we see classical architecture as a reflection of us. And this is why when I've shown, I'm going to head back, a bunch of slides back. This is why when we look at a beautiful order, it's quite reminiscent of a human body. It's proportional. And that's why we should be also wary of people who call themselves classical architectures, like the one on the left, which is not proportional. So that's why it feels wrong. So the human body is seen as a model for projection into classical architecture. On the second hand, with classical architecture in terms of materials, I'm sorry if I'm giving anyone a headache scrolling super fast. There's the idea of materiality. So in classical architecture, stone, natural materials is prioritized. And that's why when they decay, it has this nostalgic and timeless quality. It becomes a ruin. On the contrary, with modern architecture, its use of glass and steel doesn't decay. It just produces rubble. So when it ages, it's an uneasy feeling because it doesn't return to nature. That's just one of the theoretical studies that I've come across that states that. I could forward you the studies if you have any more questions later on. I could supply with the relevant texts. Right. I hope that answers your question. And if there's any other questions as well.
Any other questions? You can just raise your hand.
There is a question by Aline.
Aline, you can unmute yourself.
Good evening, Dr. Karl. Thank you for this beautiful conference. Actually, I'm not a architect. I'm a tour guide. I would like to ask about the six-sided stars used in the decoration of Bacchus temple. I don't know if you have any answer. I know it's a Eastern influence or a signature. Like we can find a lot of these kind of elements in Baalbek, like the hexagonal court. But does it have any meaning, or it is just a geometrical form? And we know that it wasn't used anywhere else but in Baalbek. And thank you very much. Hopefully you can answer me. Thank you.
Wait, you said the hexagonal court, right?
Yes, the hexagonal court and the six-sided stars used in the decoration of Bacchus temple. I don't know if you have ever noticed them. They are beautiful between the walls of the temple and the columns that surround the temple of Bacchus. And there are six-sided stars. Inside, definitely, you have the hexagonal form. Inside every hexagonal form, you have a hero, god, goddess, whatever. So is there any meaning for this this kind of geometrical form? Definitely, it's Eastern. But I'm just asking, perhaps you have an explanation for the use of this geometrical form inside the temple.
Well, I'll be honest. Thank you for this question, and you've actually sparked my curiosity. I'm not sure if I can fully answer this, but I am aware of the Eastern influences that you were talking about in terms of the star shapes. I know that they're also prevalent within the small altar, which is also a Phoenician incorporation within that Roman complex. In terms of why it's done, I think that's where the mystery comes into play. There are a lot of elements that needs to be studied further. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer for that. And in terms of the hexagonal court as well, it's a simple geometric shape that was applied that tends to be, I mean, personally, usually with most Western Roman examples, they tend to be pure circular shapes. So I think that's what makes Baalbek a distinguished type, is through that use as well. Why they did that, I have no idea. Unfortunately, on an architectural point of view, there isn't enough study about the proportional relationships and the compositions. I think the only text that we have that slightly discusses that is Theodore Wiegand's, a German archaeologist's book from the 1920s, I believe. But most of the works, unfortunately, are just more archaeological heavy and not architectural. I wish I could answer that in detail. If you could just send me your question again on an email or drop it on Classical Lebanon, Elias and I would be super happy to follow up with you on that.
Thank you, Aline. Any more questions? We'll wait for a minute.
Yeah, we'll just wait for one more.
Father Ralph?
We have Father Ralph.
Well, I want to ask about, first of all, about the French scholar who studied Fakhreddin's palace in Beirut. What's his name? And did he visit Beirut? Was he an Orientalist, or was he just curious or a historian? That's first of all. Second of all, well, you talked about twisting styles. I want to ask if you have an idea about Orientalized styles, not only the classical style, but also, for example, the Gothic. Do we have an Oriental twist for Gothic, or an Oriental twist for Romanesque, or all of the architectural schools? Do we have an Lebanese interpretation of it, and how much is it interesting to study this reinterpretation of many schools of arts? Thank you, Karl, again.
No, thank you for your question. Well, in the case of Fakhreddin, with the French writer, I think he was just a passerby, from what I've understood. I could be wrong. And he was there to accompany him after the Medici sent, after Fakhreddin returned back to Lebanon with people that would help him reconstruct and build Lebanon as well. So they sent out a few engineers and architects. I think he was just a part of the court, the entourage of a court, and he just wrote a bit of a note on that. I'm not sure if he was a scholar of some sort. And in terms of Lebanese interpretations, I mean, that's the thing with traditional works of architecture, whether you see it with a centralized house in Lebanon or churches, there's a mishmash of many things going on. They're all individual statements rather than categorical designs. So that's why in some cases you will find, I mean, you have a lot of excellent examples on your page. I think you've posted one recently with the Rosette stone, which is Gothic, but at the same time was a design from the 1800s. So it was a neo-Gothic interpretation. In terms of school, I'm not aware if there was any school of thought going on in Lebanon or if these were just individual commissions. And I think that's where we as architects need to come in and just create measured drawings to understand and dissect the thought process behind it. It's uncharted territory at this point. I hope that answers your question, Father Ralph.
Thank you.
All right.
Any other questions?
Well, it doesn't seem so, but if anyone is interested, to ask any questions later on, just feel free to follow Classical Lebanon, drop us a message. We're more than happy to help you if you need, maybe a general reading list of classical architectural works and the principles behind it. So please feel free to drop us a message at any time. We're happy to help.
It's a very interesting and well-recommended account. Thank you, Karl, a lot for this conference. For this, Joe wants to say something.
Joe has one question.
Yes.
All right.
Yes, a second question. Karl, why do you, I know it's a very long subject, but why do you think in universities they frown upon classical architecture studies? Is it like by fear of not being able to go any forward in this type of architecture, or is it maybe an architecture interpretation of modern philosophy and post-humanistic philosophies? So this, because my brother is an architect, and every time we used to think about something classical, he kept telling us that in universities they hate this subject and they don't like classical architecture. So I would like your 2 cents about it. Yeah.
Well, you're right to a certain extent that it's about postmodern thought as well. People tend to frown upon classical architecture, well, unrightly so, because they assume that it limits creativity, and there is this concept that it is not of our time. Why isn't it not of our time? That's where I think we should challenge that notion, because there seems to be nowadays a resurgence and a revival of new classical works of architecture. Unfortunately, I only found out about this revival in my later university years. But if you go on Instagram pages, there are a lot of young new classical architectural practitioners that are coming back and challenging the status quo. So it has a lot to do with this thought that it's not of our time, and it limits creativity. So it's a long socio-political debate. And I'm also happy to recommend a book. I think there's a book called, I think that's the one. If you want to know more about it, there's The Golden City by Henry Hope Reed. I think this was published and promoted by the Institute of Classical Art and Architecture. So I would highly recommend this to understand why classical architecture was frowned upon and what we should do about it today. So that's a great book to as a reference. I highly recommend this book. Right.
Karl, thank you again for this very interesting and very professional presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your enthusiasm, and thank you all for participating in this conference. Hope to see you soon in other conferences. By this, we end our conference today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
By the way, you can find the video in a few days on our YouTube channel, the recording of this presentation. Thank you, everyone.